Fort Ancient is the largest hilltop compound in the United States, and an entire Paleo-Indian culture is named after it. But the name holds within it a lie. Watch to find out what that lie is and learn the truth about Fort Ancient. The museum on site highlights the history of Native Americans in the Ohio Valley through the time when European settlers arrived and found ancient earthworks and mounds, raising many questions. Were these structures in the way of progress? The local tribes didn't know who built them, so who did? And how old really are they? Where do they fit exactly in the long span of history? We've learned that the people who came to the Americas came by northern routes, either by a land bridge or down the coast in boats. Eventually, some of these people reached the area now known as the Ohio River Valley, following the Ice Age migration routes. In Ice Age Ohio, they found plentiful game, including large animals, both game animals and predators. These early arrivals were nomadic hunter-gatherers who followed herds of animals like mastodons and hunted them until eventually, whether through climate change or due to overhunting, the herds dwindled in size. And finally, the Ice Age megafauna became extinct. Throughout this archaic period, men and women both worked to harvest new food sources, with women being the gatherers primarily, while men were the hunters and provided the majority of the food for the family. As time passed, fluted points were made to improve hunting. Development in the archaic period is a growing emphasis on ceremony, with evidence being found of shamanistic religious practices being followed. But soon changes would come that would bring an end to past ways and transform their lives. As the ice sheets withdrew and the environment changed, there was a revolutionary change also in people's food production means. Women were the revolutionaries in this change. By developing new and better gardening techniques, the women grew a higher and higher percentage of the food that their families ate in cultivated gardens. But what crops did they grow? They learned to till their soil in order to plant their gardens with humble crops. Crops like goosefoot, varieties of squash, maygrass, erect knotweed, little barley, sunflowers, marsh elder, tobacco, and eventually corn or maize. Along with better gardening, better ways of cooking and storing food were found, with the development of pottery for many different uses. At the same time we see developments in agriculture and pottery, we begin to see mounds and earthworks appearing, which over time grew to become prominent features in the landscape following the geometries of two different cultures, the Adena culture and the Hopewell culture. The Adena culture are responsible for many of the round or conical mounds, which are generally burial mounds. While the Hopewell culture began to build platform mounds and ridge mounds. and both cultures were known for building structures with astronomical alignments for determining the timing of the seasons. Along with mound building, trade routes were established that not only traveled routes to the local communities nearby, but also through those communities to cultures from a wide area. Because there is no written record of these times, we must rely on what we can find in the archaeological record through the use of systematic excavations along with newer techniques, and an examination of the various artifacts that can be discovered that way. Eventually, trade ties between the settlements seem to have broken down due to changing times, and new cultures replaced the Adena and the Hopewell cultures that had been there previously. Around 1000 CE, a new society based on agricultural villages rose. This period is the time of the rise of the neighboring Mississippian and Fort Ancient cultures, along with a group of surrounding cultures, each with its own distinctive pottery style and stone toolkit. These groups include the Whittlesey people, the Monongahela people, the Western Basin people, along with other late woodland people. As the populations of these cultures grew and resources became a point of friction between the groups, evidence can be found that supports increased conflict. Evidence like patterns of burning found on pots and other artifacts. Over time, the people of the Fort Ancient culture dwindled in number and were eventually either replaced or assimilated by later groups. Eventually, European people began to arrive, creating another revolutionary change in the lives of the Native Americans living in Ohio. And along with the Europeans came deadly diseases. Diseases that often the European settlers would weaponize to use against the native population. In the end, Native Americans found they often had to choose sides in wars between different groups of Europeans, much against their own interests. While all of this is interesting and informative, what does it have to do with a huge lie at Fort Ancient? We talked about the Fort Ancient people somewhere in there along the line, didn't we? Along with the Mississippian people. They lived in a site that's huge, 125 acres, enclosed within 18,000 feet of earthen embankments. These embankments are built on the edge of a bluff 245 feet above the Little Miami River. It is the largest and best preserved hilltop enclosure in the entire United States, with earthworks that presently stand at between 4 and 23 feet in height. That's very impressive. But what else do we know about this culture? We know that the site contains a number of paved stone circles, but we don't know what they were used for or why they were put there. We know that the Fort Ancient people did not live in a vacuum, that they lived in a world that had other societies around them. They were contemporaries of the Middle Mississippian culture, and they were prominent between 1000 CE and 1600 CE, at least 600 years. We know that the Fort Ancient people put their villages in areas that had fertile soil where they could grow corn, beans, and squash. And we know that they relied 80% on agriculture for their food. But we also know that these earthwork walls were built sometime between 100 BCE and 500 CE. So they could not have been built by the Fort Ancient culture and were instead built by the people from the earlier Hopewell culture in the Middle Woodland period. Not only that, but we know that it is not a single enclosure, it's three joined enclosures, which were not even all built at the same time, with the large southern enclosure being built first before the other ones. The earthworks that make up the enclosure are indeed very impressive. But one thing you have to ask yourself when you look at them is, do they actually make a good defensive barrier? And really you have to answer that with the answer no, they don't, because there are approximately 67 different openings that show no evidence of having any defensive gate structures, and that brings archaeologists to doubt whether the enclosure's purpose was defensive. So in the end, Fort Ancient isn't even really a fort. The Hopewell people who built the embankments that make up the enclosure do not appear to have ever lived at the Fort Ancient site. Instead, they lived in small dispersed villages and used the Fort Ancient site, starting with the larger southern enclosure, for spiritual and communal gatherings only. So it had no reason to have defensive walls. Many people point to the apparent moats that are behind the walls as evidence of defensive structures. However, these moats aren't really moats. What they are is the flooded remnants of the barrow pits where the soil was taken to build the ramparts or build the walls. Use of the site as a spiritual center seems to predate the Hopewell people as well, having gone back at least as far as to the Adena people who built the first mound at Fort Ancient in the early woodland period sometime between 1000 BCE and 100 BCE. But the Adena people also did not live at Fort Ancient. They also lived in small dispersed hunter-gatherer communities out in the woodland. The first people to actually live on the site were the Fort Ancient people, who occupied the older Hopewell enclosure, building a village there in the late prehistoric period. The earliest archaeological studies of the site found artifacts from the later occupation, within the enclosure and assumed that the people who had left the artifacts were the same people that had built the embankments, which had the appearance of European hill forts. So they named both the site and the culture that left the settlement artifacts Fort Ancient. It was only after later excavations that it was understood that the embankments in the settlement represented two completely separate phases of site occupation. To this day, we don't actually know what either the Hopewell people or the Fort Ancient people actually called themselves. All we know was what was in the archaeological record. And looking at the archaeological record, we made assumptions, and we simply gave them names. But now we do know that Fort Ancient was probably never a fort, nor was it built by the Fort Ancient people who lived there. It was built by the earlier Hopewell people for whom it was a social and ceremonial center, and that's the true history of the place that we call Fort